Welcome back, AP. This is Chapter 19, Drifting Toward Disunion. This chapter continues analyzing some of the events that lead up to the Civil War and cause sectionalism between the North and the South. Again, this chapter focuses on Key Concept 5.2. Some of the key terms that will be discussed in this chapter, and some of the people who you should be familiar with from this chapter. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was white, published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 as an attempt to show the North the horrors of slavery. The novel was published abroad, including France and Britain. It helped to start the Civil War and to end it. Hinton R. Helper was a non-aristocrat from North Carolina, and he wrote The Impending Crisis of the South in 1857. Hated by both slavery and blacks, it attempted to use statistics to prove indirectly that the non-slaveholding whites were the ones who suffered the most from slavery. The North-South contest for Kansas. Most of the people who came into Kansas were just westward moving pioneers. The minority of the people moving to Kansas was financed by groups of Northern abolitionists who wanted to see Kansas as a free state. The New England Immigrant Aid Company was one of these groups. In 1855, the day that the first territorial legislatures were to be elected, many pro-slavery people came in from the slave state Missouri to vote. Enacting pro-slavery officials. The slavery supporters set up their own government at Shawnee Mission. The Free Soilers then set up their own government in Topeka, giving the Kansas Territory two governments. Kansas and Nebraska territories were to have popular sovereignty in choosing slavery according to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Nebraska was so far north that its future as a free state was never in question. In 1856, the Civil War in Kansas started when a group of pro-slavery writers burned down a part of the free soil town of Lawrence. John Brown was a fanatical abolitionist who, in May of 1856, in response to the pro-slavery events in Lawrence, hacked to death 5 presumed pro-slavery men at Pottawatomie Creek. Civil war flared up in Kansas in 1856 and continued until it merged with the nation's Civil War of 1861 to 65. In 1857, Kansas had enough people to apply for statehood. Its citizens were going to vote again on whether or not to have slavery in the state of Kansas. In order to keep the Free Soilers from creating a free state, the pro-slavery politicians created the Lee-Compton Constitution. The document stated that the people were not allowed to vote for or against the Constitution as a whole. Rather, they could vote on whether the Constitution would be with slavery or without slavery. If slavery was voted against, then one of the provisions in the Constitution would protect those who already had slaves in Kansas. Many Free Soilers boycotted voting, so the pro-slaveryites voted approving the Constitution to include slavery. James Buchanan, a Democrat, succeeded Pierce as president of the U.S. He had a strong Southern influence and approved the Lee-Compton Constitution. Senator Stephen Douglas was strongly opposed to the document and he campaigned against it. Eventually, a compromise was reached that enabled the people of Kansas to vote on the Lee-Compton Constitution itself. It was revoked by the Free Soil voters, but Kansas remained a territory until 1861, when the Southern states seceded from the Union. President Buchanan divided the powerful Democratic Party by enraging the Douglas Democrats of the North. he divided the only remaining national party, and with it, the Union. In 1856, abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a provoking speech condemning pro-slavery men. During this speech, Sumner also personally insulted Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. 2 days later, on May 22, 1856, Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, beat Sumner with a cane to unconsciousness. The speech made by Sumner was applauded in the North, angering the South. The clash between Sumner and Butler showed how violent and impassioned the Northerners and Southerners were for their cause. Meeting in Cincinnati, the Democrats chose James Buchanan as their presidential candidate to run in the election of 1856. Because he wasn't influenced by the Kansas-Nebraska Act as Pierce and Douglas had been, the Democratic platform campaigned for popular sovereignty. Meeting in Philadelphia, the Republicans chose Captain John C. Fremont because he was also not influenced by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Republican platform campaigned against the extension of slavery. The American Party, also called the Know Nothing Party, was formed by Protestants who were alarmed by the increase of immigrants from Ireland and Germany. They chose former President Millard Fillmore as their candidate for the election of 1856. James Buchanan won the election of 1856. It was quite possibly a good thing that the Republican Party did not win the election, because some Southerners said the election of a Republican president would mean war, forcing them to secede. This election was a small victory for the Republican Party because the party was just 2 years old, yet putting up a fight with the Democrats. Dred Scott, a slave who lived with his master in the residence in Missouri for 5 years in Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, sued for his freedom on the basis of his long residence on free soil. The Supreme Court ruled that because a slave was private property, he could be taken to any territory and legally held there in slavery. The Fifth Amendment forbade Congress from depriving people of their property without the due process of law. The court went further and stated that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and that Congress had no power to ban slavery from the territories, no matter what the territorial legislations themselves wanted. This victory delighted Southerners, while it infuriated Northerners and supporters of popular sovereignty. The Panic of 1857 broke out due to California gold inflating the currency and overspeculation in land and railroads. The North was the hardest hit, while the South, with its cotton, continued to flourish. Northerners came up with the idea of the government giving 160-acre plots of farming land to pioneers for free. Two groups opposed the idea. Eastern industrialists feared that the free land would drain its supply of workers, and the South feared that the West would fill up with free soilers who would form anti-slavery states, unbalancing the Senate even more. Congress passed the Homestead Act in 1860, making public lands available at 25 cents an acre, but it was vetoed by President Buchanan. The tariff of 1857 lowered duties to about 20%. The North blamed it for causing the panic because they needed higher duties for more protection. This gave the Republicans two economic issues for the election of 1860: protection for the unprotected and farms for the farmless. In Illinois' senatorial election of 1858, the Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln to run against Democrat Stephen Douglas. Lincoln served in the Illinois legislature as a Whig politician and served one term in Congress. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of 7 debates that were arranged from August to October 1858. The most famous debate came at Freeport, Illinois. Lincoln asked Douglas, "What if the people of a territory should vote down slavery?" The Supreme Court and the Dred Scott decision had decreed that the people could not. Douglas's reply to him became known as the Freeport Doctrine. Douglas argued that no matter how the Supreme Court ruled, slavery would stay down if the people voted it down. Laws to protect slavery would have to be voted on by the territorial legislatures. Douglas won the senatorial election, but Lincoln won the popular vote. Abolitionist John Brown's scheme was to invade the South secretly with a handful of followers, call upon the slaves to rise, give the slaves weapons, and establish a black free state as a sanctuary. In October 1859, he seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Because many of his supporters failed to show up, he was caught and sent to death by hanging. When Brown died, he lived on as a martyr to the abolitionist cause. For the election of 1860, the Democrats met in Charleston, South Carolina to choose their candidate. The northern wing of the party wanted to nominate Stephen Douglas, but the Southern fire-eater saw him as a traitor for his unpopular opposition to the Lecompton Constitution and unpopular Freeport Doctrine reply. After the delegates from most of the Cotton states walked out, the Democrats met again in Baltimore to elect a candidate. This time, Douglas was elected despite the fact that the Southerners again walked out. The Southern Democrats met in Baltimore to choose their own Democratic presidential candidate, and they chose Vice President John C. Breckinridge. The platform favored the extension of slavery into the territories and the annexation of a slave-populated Cuba. The Constitutional Union Party was formed by former Whigs and Know-Nothings, and they nominated John Bell as their presidential candidate. The Republican Party met in Chicago and nominated Abraham Lincoln as their presidential candidate. The Republican Party platform had an appeal to nearly every part of the nation. For the Free Soilers, non-extension of slavery. For the Northern manufacturers, a protective tariff. For the immigrants, no abridgment of rights. For the Northwest, a Pacific Railroad. For the West, internal improvements at federal expense. And for the farmers, free homesteads or plots of land from the public domain. The Southerners said that if Abraham Lincoln was elected as president, the Union would split. Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860, but he did not win the popular vote. 60% of the nation voted for another candidate. 10 southern states didn't even allow Lincoln's name to appear on the ballot. South Carolina was happy at the outcome of the election because it now had a reason to secede. Even though the Republicans won the presidential election, they did not control the House of Representatives, the Senate, or the Supreme Court. In December of 1860, South Carolina's legislature met in Charleston and voted unanimously to secede. 6 other states joined South Carolina: Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The 7 seceders met at Montgomery, Alabama in February of 1861 and created a government known as the Confederate States of America. The states chose Jefferson Davis, a recent member of the U.S. Senate from Mississippi, as the president. During this time of secession, Buchanan was still president, for Lincoln was not sworn in until 1861. President Buchanan did not hold the seceders in the Union by force because he was surrounded by Southern advisors, and he could find no authority in the Constitution to stop them with force. One important reason that the tiny army of 15,000 men of the Union was needed to control the Indians of the West. The Crittenden amendments to the Constitution were designed to appease the South. They said that slavery in the territories was to be prohibited north of the 36 degree by 30 minute, but south of that line was to be given federal protection in all territories existing or hereby acquired. Basically, states north of the line could come into the Union with or without slavery, depending on what they chose, but below that line there would always be slavery. President Lincoln objected these amendments. The Southern states seceded, fearing that the Republican Party would threaten their rights to own slaves. Many Southerners felt that their secession would be unopposed by the North. They assumed that the Northern manufacturers and bankers dependent upon Southern cotton markets wouldn't dare cut off the South.